capital and everything else globally?
China certainly wants Operation Epic Fury to end as soon as possible because China's strategic interest lies in the peace and the stability in the Middle East. However, I think if you look at China's response to Operation Epic Fury, it has been quite calibrated and composed. A lot of it lies behind the diplomatic choreography is the deep anxiety that is underneath it all. China is currently encountering four fears as the Iran war breaks out, and they compound into an overlapping crisis. The first one is the fear over energy security. 74% of China's energy relies on import, and the 55% of which comes from the greater Gulf region. So China obviously encounters a severe energy vulnerability. But bigger than the vulnerability on the oil infrastructure is actually the infrastructure choke points for global trade and economy on which China depends. And so this year, interestingly, President Trump has simultaneously tightened grip on four of the world's maritime choke points simultaneously, not one, but all four. The Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, obviously the U.S. has a strong command over the Strait of Malacca, and now major disruptions are being caused at the Strait of Hormuz. And we saw that in the past 15 years, China has been trying to build infrastructure alternatives to engineer its route for global shipping. We can see through this crisis in Iran that none of the infrastructure that China has spent hundreds of billions of dollars on over the past 15 years has been proven sufficient to tackle the crisis. And obviously the third fear is the Trump's coercive statecraft, as some of our panelists have just mentioned earlier. Trump-era statecraft seems to be very willing to coerce regime change and decapitate leaders of sovereign countries that are antagonistic to America. In the fourth fear, I think it's perhaps the most enduring one because it has nothing to do with economics, but has to do with morality. That is President Xi's unfinished world order. China proposes itself as the leader of the global South and calls for multipolarity to replace Pax Americana. And as we see today, by losing the leadership from the U.S.'s own undoing, it doesn't automatically transfer that faith of leadership to China.
At what point do you think President Xi looks around the world, he sees what Putin is doing in Ukraine, he sees what Trump is doing in Iran with Israel, and thinks maybe it's time I do something in Taiwan?
Taiwan is clearly China's red line, the core of the core Chinese national security interests, as has been perfectly framed by the Chinese foreign policy circle. So on the Taiwan question, it's no doubt it is where China's political legitimacy, I think President Xi's personal legacy, and the China's national interest all converge. Back in February, when President Xi had a call with President Trump, the White House subsequently delayed arms sales to Taiwan. And I think that message has been communicated very clearly as a fundamental headline issue for China on which all of the other issues can be bargained upon. So that includes either the war in Iran and the support which China puts out. It could be rare earths, it could be tariffs or any other trade items, all of which are bargainable items. However, Taiwan is a undisputed, unbargainable issue. So I think currently the strategic priority, as we see with China's response to the Iran crisis, the critical priority for China is to stabilize U.S.-China relations, particularly before the Trump-Xi meeting. And it's important for China to hold the economy together. And I think by stabilizing U.S.-China relations, it's going to give China some sort of external confidence, which the domestic policy environment does not currently enable. So by 2027, at the Communist Party Congress, very likely President Xi will seek the fourth term of presidency. And I think it's important. And by then, the Chinese economy managed to hold together. And that means that China needs to consider U.S.-China relations at the core of all its foreign policy variables.
Just spell out for us how well prepared China is if we are now embarking on a global energy crisis. How prepared is China to ride it out?
In 2025, China has stockpiled 430,000 barrels of crude oil per day. So if you were to look at the energy import increase in 2025 alone, 87% of which were dedicated to stockpiling. So which really is indicative of China's ongoing fear, and I should say deepening fear about its energy vulnerability. And I think in order to truly understand China's dependence on crude oil and LNG, we need to look beyond the headlines of renewable energy transition, the EV market dominance, and the solar panels everywhere inside China. So we could say that the petrol economy that's led by fuels, diesel, or jet fuel, or gasoline, those are plateauing in China. However, the petrochemical industry continues to rise. Other than coal, oil and the LNG continues to power China's building, shipping, and its manufacturing industry. So China continues to have a huge dependence on its oil imports. However, Venezuelan, the capture of Maduro at on January the 3rd, we could see that in February, there were 370,000 barrels of additional oil being imported from Russia to China. And so that largely replenishes the loss of oil coming from Venezuela. However, the Persian Gulf is entirely a different story. We're not talking about just the oil from Iran potentially facing disruptions for China, but the entire oil producing region out there, which supplies over half of China's oil. So what that means is, by default, if the energy crisis, particularly the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, continues, China will have to fall back to its default option by importing more oil from Russia.